You are standing in the private chambers of Hampton Court Palace on a sweltering July morning in 1546, and the putrid stench of decomposing flesh hits your nostrils like a physical blow. The air is thick with the metallic tang of infected blood and the sickly sweet reek of pus that has been festering for over a decade. 3 rooms away, servants are drawing straws to determine who must approach the King of England to dress his suppurating leg ulcers. Wounds so grotesquely infected that courtiers can identify Henry VIII's approach by scent alone before he ever appears in their sight. The man who once stood 6 feet 2 inches of athletic perfection, who composed music and wrote poetry in 4 languages, who charmed European courts with his Renaissance brilliance, now weighs over 400 pounds and requires mechanical devices just to move his bloated carcass from room to room. But here is the truly horrifying truth that will make your skin crawl with revulsion. This walking nightmare of suppurating wounds, paranoid delusions, and monstrous obesity still considers himself the most magnificent specimen of manhood in Christendom, and he will murder anyone who suggests otherwise. The transformation of Henry VIII from Renaissance prince to decomposing tyrant represents one of the most grotesque psychological and physical deteriorations in human history. When he ascended the English throne in 1509 at 18 years old, contemporary observers described him as the handsomest potentate they had ever encountered, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun gold and a complexion so fair and bright that foreign ambassadors wrote rapturous descriptions to their governments. Fast forward 37 years to his death in 1547. And the same man has become a walking catalog of medical horrors, so revolting that his own physicians struggled to remain in the same room while treating him. The stench from his infected leg ulcers was so overwhelming that it could be detected from 3 chambers away, often serving as an olfactory herald announcing the approach of the king before he appeared. His obesity had reached such catastrophic proportions that his armor from 1540 measured 52 inches around the waist, transforming him into a grotesque parody of the warrior king he had once embodied. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The medical evidence surrounding Henry's transformation reads like a medieval horror story written by a particularly sadistic physician. His personal collection of remedies, preserved in manuscripts created between 1540 and 1545, reveals a man so desperate to cure his deteriorating condition that he concocted treatments that would have made medieval torture devices seem merciful by comparison. Among the 300 different medications in his royal pharmacopoeia were compounds containing ground pearl for melancholy, powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk for poison prevention, human skull moss for epilepsy, and most revolting of all, long worms of the earth, which were simply earthworms ground into paste and applied directly to open wounds. The king's medicine chest also contained litharge of gold, a lead compound that was literally poisoning him while he believed it was healing him, and Venetian ceruse, another lead-based cosmetic that was slowly destroying his nervous system from within. Henry's personal involvement in creating these medical abominations reveals a mind that had lost all connection to rational thought. He personally devised an ointment at Hampton Court that he grandly titled a Pusset ointment devised by the King Majesty at Hampton Court to heal excoriations, a concoction that combined nightshade, white lead, and what contemporary records describe as diverse other venomous substances. The fact that the King of England was literally poisoning himself with lead-based compounds while believing he was demonstrating his medical expertise would be comical if it were not so tragically pathetic. His physicians, terrified of contradicting the increasingly paranoid monarch, allowed him to continue these experimental treatments even as they watched him deteriorate before their eyes. The genesis of Henry's physical destruction can be traced to a single catastrophic moment on January 24, 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. The king, wearing full armor and riding at speed, was thrown from his horse when the animal fell directly on top of him. Contemporary accounts describe the impact as so severe that Henry remained unconscious for over 2 hours, a duration that in the 16th century often preceded death. Modern medical analysis suggests that this accident caused severe traumatic brain injury, specifically damage to the frontal lobe that controls impulse regulation and emotional processing. The correlation between this injury and the dramatic increase in Henry's arbitrary executions and erratic behavior provides compelling evidence that the accident fundamentally altered his personality at a neurological level. But the head injury was merely the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. The same jousting accident burst a varicose ulcer on his left leg, reopening and aggravating an injury he had sustained in 1527. What began as a manageable wound evolved into a festering catastrophe that would torment him for the remaining 11 years of his life. Medical historians examining contemporary accounts suggest these ulcers were caused by chronic venous insufficiency, likely complicated by what we now recognize as type 2 diabetes. The pain was described by court observers as excruciating and constant, with Henry's leg wounds requiring regular cauterization with red-hot irons, a medieval torture that masqueraded as medical treatment. The smell emanating from Henry's infected legs became legendary at court for all the wrong reasons. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence describes the putrid odor as so overwhelming that courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when approaching the king. While some accounts suggest the stench was detectable from several rooms away and often served as an early warning system for Henry's arrival. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, writing to Emperor Charles V, described Henry's legs as the worst legs in the world, while French diplomatic dispatches referred to the pestilential emanations that surrounded the English monarch wherever he went. Henry's medical team, led by court physicians Dr. William Butts, Thomas Vickery, Dr. Chamber, Dr. Owen, and Dr. Clement, found themselves in an impossible position as they watched their royal patient destroy himself with increasingly bizarre treatments. The king's ulcers were deliberately kept open with strings and sprinkled with gold pellets, because contemporary medical theory held that suppurating wounds needed to run in order to heal properly. This medieval understanding of medicine meant that Henry's physicians were systematically preventing his injuries from healing while believing they were providing the most advanced treatment available. The result was a perpetual state of infection that gradually poisoned his entire system while causing unimaginable pain. The psychological impact of chronic pain on Henry's personality cannot be overstated. Modern medical research demonstrates that persistent pain fundamentally alters brain chemistry, leading to increased aggression, paranoia, and diminished empathy. Henry's transformation from the jovial, charismatic prince of 1509 to the suspicious, violent tyrant of the 1540s follows a pattern that contemporary pain management specialists would immediately recognize. Sleep became increasingly elusive as the agony from his legs prevented rest, leading to the insomnia and mood swings that became legendary among courtiers who learned to read the signs of his approaching rages like meteorologists tracking incoming storms. Henry's response to his physical deterioration was to double down on projections of masculine power through increasingly ridiculous displays of artificial virility. The famous Holbein portrait of 1537, showing Henry in his iconic wide-legged stance with an enormously exaggerated codpiece, was carefully composed to mask his physical decline through artistic propaganda. The portrait's forced perspective made Henry appear taller and broader than he actually was, while his legs were positioned to hide his suppurating ulcers behind layers of padded clothing and strategic drapery. Most grotesquely, his codpiece was stuffed with sawdust and reinforced with whalebone, creating a parody of masculinity so absurd that it bordered on unintentional comedy. The king's clothing became increasingly elaborate as his body failed, with inventory records showing Henry owned over 2,000 items of clothing, including doublets padded with horsehair to create the illusion of a muscular chest where only obesity remained. His garments required specially reinforced construction to support his massive weight, while his codpieces grew to such preposterous proportions that foreign ambassadors wrote amazed descriptions of the English king's anatomical displays. The tragic irony was that Henry's desperate attempts to project sexual prowess came at a time when medical evidence suggests he was suffering from severe erectile dysfunction, making his oversized codpieces a monument to precisely the inadequacy he was trying to hide. Henry's eating habits during his decline reveal a man whose relationship with food had become as dysfunctional as every other aspect of his existence. Court records indicate he consumed 3 full meals daily, with particular enthusiasm for galantines, game pies, and haggis, washing down enormous quantities of food with wine, beer, and gin. The slaughter of birds for Henry's table was described by contemporary observers as prodigious, with menus featuring larks, storks, gannets, herons, snipes, bustards, quails, partridges, capons, teals, cranes, and pheasants. Sparrow pie was listed as a particular favorite, while the king also consumed salted and fresh fish, including cod, herrings, eels, salmon, and most bizarrely, porpoises and dolphins. The scale of food preparation required to satisfy Henry's appetite was staggering in its excess. Hampton Court Palace featured 18 kitchens and 50 smaller rooms dedicated to food preparation, with 200 kitchen staff working constantly to feed the king and his court of over 1,000 attendants. The Great Kitchen contained 6 open fires with spits continuously roasting pork and venison, burning an estimated 6 to 8 tons of oak daily just to keep the fires burning. Banquets became 14-course theatrical spectacles with peacocks serving as the centerpiece, roasted and then presented with their blue feathers and gold-gilded beaks still in place to create the illusion that the magnificent birds were still alive. But Henry's dietary preferences extended far beyond mere gluttony into realms that can only be described as grotesque. Contemporary menus included cockentrice, a nightmarish creation that combined the front half of a pig with the back half of a chicken, sewn together and roasted as a single entity. Even more disturbing were the exotic meats that graced the royal table, including beaver tail, which was considered a delicacy, and various preparations of what contemporary recipes euphemistically termed strange flesh. The king's chefs competed to create increasingly bizarre combinations of meat and fowl, resulting in monstrosities that would have challenged even the strongest medieval stomach. Fresh fruit was systematically avoided in Henry's diet because contemporary medical theory held that it caused diarrhea and fever, with the notable exception of cherries, which the king consumed in vast quantities during their brief season. This dietary restriction meant that Henry's diet was almost entirely devoid of vitamin C, leading to scurvy symptoms that compounded his other medical problems. The irony was that the royal court's sophisticated approach to medicine was systematically depriving the king of essential nutrients, while loading him with harmful substances, creating a perfect storm of malnutrition disguised as royal luxury. Henry's sexual dysfunction became an open secret at court, though none dared speak of it directly for fear of their lives. The king's marriages became increasingly desperate attempts to prove his continued virility, even as medical evidence suggests he was suffering from severe impotence by the time of his marriage to Catherine Howard in 1540. His choice of the teenage Catherine as his 5th wife represents a particularly pathetic attempt by a diseased, obese, 50-year-old man to recapture the sexual vigor of his youth through proximity to youthful beauty. When a marriage predictably failed to produce the desired results, Henry's response was to have Catherine executed for adultery, blaming her for his own physical inadequacies. The medical records surrounding Henry's later marriages paint a picture of a man whose body had betrayed him in the most fundamental ways possible. Contemporary accounts suggest that by the 1540s, Henry required assistance even to mount his horse, while his legendary appetite for hunting and jousting had been reduced to watching others perform activities he could no longer manage. His final marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 was interpreted by court observers as Henry acquiring a convenient nursemaid rather than a wife, someone who could manage his medical care while maintaining the fiction that he remained a functioning monarch. Henry's paranoia during his final years reached levels that would have impressed the most creative modern conspiracy theorists. His fear of illness became so overwhelming that he required his physicians to examine him every morning of his life, convinced that any delay in treatment might prove fatal. He learned as much as possible about contemporary medicine, creating his own remedies from a hidden cabinet of ingredients in his private apartments, mixing compounds with the desperate enthusiasm of a medieval alchemist convinced that the next concoction might restore his lost youth and vigor. The king's hypochondria manifested in increasingly bizarre ways as his condition worsened. He banned mirrors from his presence after 1540, unable to bear seeing his physical deterioration reflected back at him. His sleep patterns became completely erratic, with periods of staying awake for days followed by 18-hour stretches of unconsciousness. Most dangerously, Henry began to interpret any reminder of human frailty as a personal attack on his divine authority, leading to executions for offenses as minor as coughing in the royal presence or appearing tired during court ceremonies. The creation of the Church of England revealed Henry's megalomania in its purest form, representing not a theological revolution, but the ultimate temper tantrum by a man who could not accept being told no by any authority, earthly or divine. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1533, Henry did not simply break with Rome. He rewrote the entire religious structure of England to place himself at its head, creating a legal framework where his personal desires literally became religious law. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, granting him religious authority that even medieval kings had never dared claim. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 represented Henry's most cynical abuse of religious authority for personal financial gain. The confiscation of monastery lands transferred approximately £13 million annually to the crown, roughly equivalent to £1 billion in contemporary currency. Henry used religious justification to conduct what was essentially the largest property seizure in English history, destroying centuries of religious and cultural heritage to fund his increasingly expensive lifestyle and foreign military adventures that accomplished nothing beyond inflating his ego. Henry's financial irresponsibility during his reign was so catastrophic that it bordered on economic sabotage. He inherited one of Europe's most stable treasuries from his father, Henry VII, who had accumulated approximately £1,250,000 in gold and silver through years of careful financial management. Within a decade, Henry had spent this entire inheritance on wars that accomplished nothing except satisfying his delusions of military glory. The French campaigns of 1512 to 1514 and 1522 to 1525 cost over £1 million with virtually nothing to show for their expense, except a few strategically worthless French towns that were immediately lost again. By 1526, Henry was forced to debase the English currency for the first time in centuries, reducing the silver content of coins by 25% to provide temporary financial relief. This emergency measure created inflation that devastated ordinary English families while providing only brief respite for the royal treasury. The Great Debasement continued throughout Henry's reign, ultimately reducing English currency to less than half its original silver content and creating economic instability that persisted for decades after his death. By 1547, England was effectively bankrupt with debts exceeding £4 million, leaving Henry's successors to deal with the financial catastrophe he had created. The king's personal expenses during his decline were so extravagant that they defied rational comprehension. Hampton Court Palace alone cost over £62,000 to build and furnish, equivalent to roughly £50 million in contemporary currency. Henry maintained a court of over 1,000 people, requiring constant expenditure on food, clothing, and entertainment that exceeded the annual income of most English counties. His personal wardrobe expenses alone surpassed the total tax revenue from entire regions of England, while his collection of palaces required armies of servants and constant maintenance that consumed vast resources. When traditional taxation proved insufficient to fund Henry's lifestyle, he resorted to increasingly desperate and tyrannical measures to extract money from his subjects. The Amicable Grant of 1525 was essentially forced taxation that nearly provoked rebellion, while Henry's seizure of monastery lands was followed by the forced sale of confiscated property to nobles who were required to purchase it at inflated prices or face charges of treason. The king's financial desperation made him increasingly vindictive toward anyone who appeared to possess wealth, leading to executions and property confiscations based on transparent pretexts designed to refill the royal treasury. Henry's relationship with his wives reveals the psychology of a man whose narcissism had reached pathological levels, where other human beings existed solely to serve his needs and could be discarded or destroyed when they failed to provide satisfaction. The famous rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, reduces 6 women's lives to their relationship with a monster. But examining each marriage reveals different aspects of Henry's cruelty and the escalating desperation of his attempts to prove his continued virility through sexual conquest. Catherine of Aragon endured 24 years of marriage to a man who ultimately declared their entire relationship invalid, confining her to increasingly remote castles and forbidding her from seeing their daughter Mary for the final years of her life. She died in 1536, possibly from cancer, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. Her final message signed Catherine the Queen in a defiant assertion of her status that Henry never acknowledged. Her death was met with celebrations at court, with Henry and in Boleyn dressing in yellow to mark what they saw as the removal of an obstacle to their happiness. And Boleyn's execution in 1536 was preceded by a show trial that would have impressed Soviet prosecutors with its complete fabrication of evidence. Henry had her brother George and 4 other men tortured into confessing adultery with the Queen, forcing and to watch their executions before her own. The charges were so obviously manufactured that even Henry's supporters expressed embarrassment, but the king's paranoia had reached the point where he saw treason in every glance and conspiracy in every conversation. Anne's final letter to Henry, if authentic, reveals a woman desperately trying to understand how the man who had pursued her for years had transformed into her executioner. Jane Seymour died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI, likely from puerperal sepsis, but Henry's reaction revealed his fundamental selfishness in its purest form. He mourned her not as a person who had died serving his ambitions, but as the wife who had finally given him a son, the only role he had ever valued in any woman. Within weeks of her funeral, he was already considering his next marriage, viewing Jane's death as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Her primary value to Henry had been her reproductive capacity, and once she had fulfilled that function, her continued existence became irrelevant to his needs. Anne of Cleves survived by accepting complete humiliation rather than risking execution, agreeing to an annulment based on Henry's claim that their marriage was unconsummated due to her appearance. Her survival strategy required calling Henry brother for the rest of his life and never remarrying, living as a pensioner completely dependent on his goodwill. The fact that she was considered fortunate to escape with this arrangement reveals the terror that Henry inspired in anyone who came within his orbit, where even queens could be destroyed on a monarch's whim. Catherine Howard was approximately 19 when Henry had her executed in 1542 for adultery that consisted primarily of relationships that occurred before her marriage and possibly one flirtation afterward. Henry passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history, essentially criminalizing normal teenage behavior retroactively. The execution of a teenager for the crime of having had relationships before marrying a diseased, obese tyrant 30 years her senior represents Henry's narcissism at its most grotesque, where his ego was more important than human life. Catherine Parr survived by transforming herself into Henry's nurse rather than his wife, managing his medical care, editing his writings, and carefully avoiding any topic that might trigger his paranoia. Her survival required the complete suppression of her own personality in service to a dying tyrant's ego, demonstrating the psychological toll that proximity to Henry exacted even on those who managed to escape with their lives. She was described by court observers as prematurely aged by the stress of managing Henry's moods and medical needs, sacrificing her own well-being to avoid becoming his seventh victim. Henry's execution record during his 38-year reign reads like a catalog of medieval atrocities, with conservative estimates suggesting he ordered the deaths of over 70,000 people, approximately 5 executions per day, throughout his entire reign. The victims range from international figures like Sir Thomas More to ordinary citizens whose only crime was disagreeing with the king's policies or appearing to threaten his authority. The arbitrary nature of many executions reveals a man who had completely lost any connection to justice or mercy, viewing human life as disposable whenever it conflicted with his desires. Sir Thomas More's execution in 1535 shocked Europe and demonstrated Henry's willingness to destroy even his closest friends when they failed to support his ambitions. More had been Henry's Lord Chancellor and one of the most respected intellectuals of his generation, but his refusal to take an oath recognizing Henry as supreme head of the church made him a threat to the king's new religious authority. More's final words, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," became a rallying cry for Catholic resistance to Henry's religious changes and a damning indictment of the king's priorities. Thomas Cromwell's fall in 1540 demonstrates Henry's capacity for breathtaking ingratitude and betrayal. Cromwell had been the architect of Henry's break with Rome, the mastermind behind the dissolution of the monasteries, and the king's most effective administrator for over a decade. When the Anne of Clevy's marriage failed to meet Henry's expectations, the king needed a scapegoat and turned on the man who had made his entire religious revolution possible. Cromwell was arrested without warning, denied a trial, and executed within weeks, his destruction accomplished with a casual cruelty that shocked even hardened court observers. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 revealed Henry at his most duplicitous and calculating. When 40,000 Northern Catholics rebelled against his religious changes, Henry promised pardons and negotiations to convince the rebels to disperse. Once they had returned to their homes, he systematically hunted down and executed their leaders, breaking his royal word with a cynicism that demonstrated his complete contempt for honor or honesty. The betrayal was so blatant that even his supporters expressed unease, but Henry viewed keeping faith with rebels as unnecessary constraint on royal authority. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 when Henry had her executed in 1541 for the crime of being the mother of Cardinal Reginald Pole, who had criticized Henry's break with Rome from the safety of Italy. The execution was deliberately botched, with the inexperienced headsman requiring multiple blows to kill an elderly woman whose only offense was having a son with inconvenient opinions. The prolonged butchery of a defenseless old woman revealed Henry's sadism in its purest form, where even the appearance of mercy was abandoned in favor of deliberate cruelty. The Exeter conspiracy trials of 1538 demonstrate Henry's paranoia at its most irrational peak. Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, and his associates were executed for allegedly discussing what might happen if Henry died without a male heir, conversations that would have been considered normal political discourse in any rational kingdom. The evidence was so transparently fabricated that even Henry's own council expressed doubts, but the king's fear of potential threats had overcome any concern for evidence or justice. Henry's final years were consumed by an escalating cycle of paranoia and violence that made court life a constant exercise in survival. Courtiers learned to read the subtle signs of the king's approaching rages like meteorologists tracking dangerous storms, developing elaborate strategies to avoid triggering his increasingly unpredictable fury. The slightest perceived slight could result in charges of treason, while expressing any opinion that contradicted the king's views had become a potentially capital offense. Even his closest advisors lived in constant fear of saying the wrong word or displaying the wrong expression in the royal presence. The king's sleeping arrangements during his decline reveal a man whose paranoia had reached clinical levels of severity. He kept loaded crossbows beside his bed and required guards to search his chambers multiple times each night, convinced that assassins might materialize from the shadows to end his reign. His insomnia was compounded by the constant pain from his leg ulcers, creating a vicious cycle where lack of sleep increased his paranoia, while pain prevented the rest he desperately needed. Court physicians prescribed increasingly powerful combinations of laudanum and other opiates, adding drug dependency to Henry's growing list of medical problems. The stench surrounding Henry during his final months became so overwhelming that even his most devoted servants struggled to remain in his presence. Contemporary accounts describe a putrid combination of rotting flesh, stale urine, and medicinal compounds that created an olfactory assault so powerful it could induce nausea in hardened courtiers. The king's refusal to acknowledge his condition meant that addressing the smell directly was impossible, forcing everyone around him to pretend that the nauseating odors were not present while struggling to breathe through their mouths rather than their noses. Henry's death on January 28, 1547, was as grotesque and undignified as his final years had been tragic and pathetic. His body had swollen to such enormous proportions that he required mechanical devices to move around his palaces, while the infected ulcers on his legs had spread to create a network of suppurating wounds that defied all attempts at treatment. The smell emanating from his dying body was so overwhelming that his final confession had to be conducted from across the room, with the priest struggling to maintain composure while performing the last rites for a man whose physical decay had rendered him barely recognizable as human. The king's corpse presented immediate and nauseating problems for his attendants. His body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that embalmers struggled to prepare it for burial, ultimately wrapping him in lead sheets and sealing him in multiple wooden coffins in a desperate attempt to contain the stench and prevent further decomposition. But the pressure from internal gases continued to build during the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, creating a ticking time bomb of royal remains that would explode with horrifying consequences. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Henry's coffin literally exploded during the overnight stop at St. Abbey, spraying decomposing royal remains across the hearse and surrounding area in a grotesque finale to a grotesque life. The smell was so horrific that the funeral procession had to halt while servants cleaned up the putrid mess with buckets and rags, attempting to restore some dignity to proceedings that had descended into farce. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of the king who had styled himself as God's representative on earth, providing a fitting metaphor for the ultimate fate of absolute power corrupted by absolute ego. The explosion was not merely a gruesome accident, but a perfect symbol of Henry's entire reign. Like his corpse, his kingdom had been bloated with borrowed authority and artificial grandeur, inflated beyond sustainable proportions by a monarch whose appetite for power exceeded his capacity to wield it responsibly. When the pressure became too great, everything burst apart in a spectacular display of decay and corruption, leaving a nauseating mess for others to clean up while the king's grandiose pretensions were revealed as nothing more than hot air and decomposing flesh. Henry's burial vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, had to be specially reinforced to contain what remained of his body after the explosion, while the stone tomb originally intended to house his remains was deemed insufficient to prevent further incidents of royal decomposition. When the vault was opened in 1813 for historical investigation, researchers found evidence of structural damage to the coffin that confirmed the explosion accounts, proving that even in death, Henry continued to create problems that required extraordinary measures to contain. The medical analysis of Henry's transformation reveals a perfect storm of genetic predisposition, traumatic injury, and lifestyle choices that created one of history's most dramatic examples of power corrupting both body and soul. Modern researchers suggest that Henry may have suffered from McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder carried on the X chromosome that typically manifests around age 40 with symptoms including heart disease, movement disorders, and severe psychological symptoms such as paranoia and mental decline. This condition would explain both his physical deterioration and his personality changes, providing a medical framework for understanding his transformation from Renaissance prince to tyrannical monster. The genetic theory gains additional support from evidence suggesting Henry belonged to the rare Kell-positive blood group, occurring in only 9% of the Caucasian population. When a Kell-positive man impregnates a Kell-negative woman, there is a 50% chance of producing an immune response that attacks subsequent fetuses, causing miscarriages typically between 24 and 28 weeks of gestation. This would explain the pattern of pregnancy losses experienced by both Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, where first children survived, but subsequent pregnancies ended in late-term miscarriages that devastated both mothers and further inflamed Henry's paranoia about divine punishment. The combination of chronic pain, possible brain injury, genetic disorders, and the psychological pressure of maintaining absolute authority created a feedback loop of deterioration that accelerated throughout Henry's later years. Each failed pregnancy increased his desperation for male heirs, while each execution increased his isolation from normal human relationships. His physical pain made him increasingly intolerant of others' weaknesses, while his medical treatments with lead-based compounds gradually poisoned his nervous system and contributed to his mental decline. Henry's legacy extends far beyond the religious and political changes he implemented, encompassing a broader lesson about the dangers of unchecked authority combined with personal dysfunction. His transformation demonstrates how physical suffering, psychological pressure, and unlimited power can combine to create monsters that destroy everything they touch. The medical evidence suggests that Henry's cruelty was not entirely voluntary, as brain injury and genetic disorders contributed to his behavioral changes. But millions of people suffer similar conditions without becoming mass murderers, suggesting that power and personality amplified his worst impulses rather than creating them from nothing. The king's impact on English society extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass generations of subjects who lived in fear of arbitrary royal violence. His reign established precedents for monarchical behavior that influenced royal conduct for centuries, while his religious changes created divisions that persisted long after his death. The financial devastation he created through his irresponsible spending required decades to repair, while the political instability generated by his dynastic obsessions contributed to the chaos that followed his death. The psychological portrait that emerges from examining Henry's medical records and behavioral patterns reveals a man whose fundamental humanity was gradually eroded by pain, paranoia, and the corruption that accompanies absolute authority. His early promise as a Renaissance monarch was destroyed by a combination of physical trauma, genetic predisposition, and the intoxicating effects of unlimited power over other human beings. The tragedy was not merely personal but national, as England's potential was sacrificed to serve the ego of a man whose own potential had been destroyed by circumstances beyond his control and choices within it. The international reaction to Henry's reign reveals how his personal dysfunction affected England's relationships with other European powers. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about the English king's erratic behavior, physical decline, and the atmosphere of terror that surrounded his court. These diplomatic dispatches provide some of our most reliable evidence about Henry's condition, as foreign observers had less incentive to flatter or protect a monarch whose instability made him an unreliable ally and a dangerous enemy. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis left particularly detailed accounts of Henry's deterioration, describing not only the physical symptoms, but the psychological changes that made the English king increasingly difficult to negotiate with. French diplomatic correspondence reveals similar concerns about Henry's unpredictability, while papal representatives wrote shocked accounts of the English monarch's break with centuries of religious tradition. These international perspectives provide crucial context for understanding how Henry's personal problems became diplomatic obstacles that isolated England from potential allies. The economic impact of Henry's reign on ordinary English citizens reveals the human cost of royal dysfunction translated into national policy. His debasement of the currency created inflation that devastated working families, while his seizure of monastery lands disrupted traditional systems of poor relief and education. The dissolution of religious houses eliminated institutions that had provided social services for centuries, forcing local communities to develop alternative support systems while dealing with the economic chaos created by rapidly changing royal policies. Henry's military adventures during his decline reveal a man whose physical limitations made him increasingly dependent on proxy displays of power to maintain his self-image as a warrior king. His final campaign in France in 1544, undertaken when he was already severely disabled by his leg ulcers, required extraordinary logistical efforts to transport the king in specially constructed vehicles that could accommodate his massive weight and medical needs. The campaign accomplished nothing strategically while consuming vast resources that England could not afford, demonstrating how Henry's personal need for military glory trumped rational assessment of national interests. The architectural legacy of Henry's reign reflects his obsession with creating permanent monuments to his own magnificence while his body deteriorated around him. The construction and expansion of royal palaces continued even as the treasury emptied, with Hampton Court Palace serving as the most spectacular example of Henry's architectural megalomania. The palace's design incorporated specific features to accommodate the king's declining mobility, including specially designed staircases and chambers that could be accessed without stairs, revealing how Henry's physical limitations influenced even the grandest expressions of royal power. The artistic propaganda surrounding Henry's image during his final years represents one of history's most sustained campaigns of visual deception. Portraits from the 1540s systematically concealed his obesity, disguised his mobility problems, and projected an image of vigorous masculinity that bore no relationship to physical reality. The famous cartoon by Hans Holbein, created around 1537, established the iconic image of Henry that persists in popular culture, but careful analysis reveals numerous techniques used to minimize his physical decline and maximize the impression of royal authority. The literary and musical output attributed to Henry during his later years reveals a man desperately trying to maintain intellectual credibility while his mental faculties declined. His theological writings from the 1540s show evidence of confusion and repetition that contrasts sharply with the sophisticated arguments of his earlier works. Similarly, musical compositions attributed to the king during this period lack the complexity and originality of his youthful efforts, suggesting that his creative abilities suffered along with his physical and mental health. The court culture that developed around Henry's declining years created a unique form of social interaction based on managing the psychological needs of an increasingly unstable monarch. Courtiers developed elaborate strategies for presenting information in ways that would not trigger royal rages, while entertainment and ceremony were carefully designed to reinforce Henry's self-image without acknowledging his obvious limitations. This created an atmosphere of collective delusion where everyone pretended that the king remained the magnificent figure he had once been, while privately preparing for the inevitable collapse of the entire system. The religious implications of Henry's personal decline extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of his break with Rome. His transformation from Catholic defender of the faith to Protestant supreme head of the English Church occurred during the same period as his physical and mental deterioration, raising questions about the relationship between his personal dysfunction and his theological positions. Contemporary observers noted that Henry's religious policies became increasingly erratic as his health declined, suggesting that medical problems may have influenced some of the most significant religious changes in English history. The educational and cultural impact of Henry's reign reveals how royal dysfunction can cascade through society to affect intellectual and artistic development. The dissolution of the monasteries destroyed libraries and centers of learning that had preserved knowledge for centuries, while the climate of fear surrounding the court discouraged intellectual innovation that might be interpreted as criticism of royal policies. The brain drain caused by executions and exile of prominent intellectuals like Thomas More created gaps in English cultural leadership that persisted for generations. Henry's relationship with his children during his declining years reveals a father whose capacity for normal human emotion had been largely destroyed by pain, paranoia, and the corruption of absolute power. His treatment of Mary, his daughter with Catherine of Aragon, oscillated between affection and cruelty depending on his mood and political needs. His brief relationship with his son Edward was overshadowed by Henry's obsession with the boy's symbolic importance as a male heir rather than his value as an individual child. Most tragically, his relationship with Elizabeth was virtually non-existent, as Henry's guilt over executing her mother made it impossible for him to form normal paternal bonds with and Boleyn's daughter. The technological and scientific developments that occurred during Henry's reign were largely independent of royal patronage, as the king's preoccupation with his personal problems and theological controversies left little attention for supporting innovation. The medical advances that might have helped treat his condition were actively discouraged by his preference for traditional remedies and is suspicious of new ideas that might challenge established authority. This represents a tragic missed opportunity, as Henry's personal interest in medicine could have been channeled into supporting genuine medical research instead of experimenting with dangerous compounds that poisoned him further. The environmental impact of Henry's court reveals the ecological costs of supporting a lifestyle based on conspicuous consumption and display. The massive quantities of wood required to fuel the kitchens at Hampton Court contributed to deforestation around London, while the transport of exotic foods and materials from across Europe created one of the earliest examples of environmentally destructive global supply chains. The king's hunting expeditions, undertaken even as his mobility declined, required the maintenance of vast game preserves that excluded agricultural use of valuable land. The linguistic legacy of Henry's reign includes the introduction of new vocabulary related to royal authority and religious change, much of it designed to justify unprecedented expansions of monarchical power. Terms like supreme head and defender of the faith were crafted to describe Henry's new religious role, while legal language surrounding treason was expanded to encompass virtually any criticism of royal policy. The evolution of English during this period reflects the broader social changes imposed by a monarch whose personal needs drove national transformation. The demographic impact of Henry's execution policies created lasting changes in English social structure by eliminating entire families and disrupting traditional patterns of inheritance and social mobility. The destruction of the old nobility through executions and confiscations created opportunities for new families to rise, but it also eliminated sources of potential opposition to royal authority. This demographic engineering reflected Henry's determination to remove anyone who might challenge his authority, regardless of their actual threat level or historical service to the crown. As you stand once again in those fetid royal chambers, watching servants draw straws to determine who must approach the decomposing King of England, you begin to understand that you have witnessed something far more terrifying than a simple medical decline. You have seen the complete moral and physical collapse of absolute power when it encounters the fundamental limitations of human mortality. Henry VIII's transformation from Renaissance prince to putrefying tyrant represents not just personal tragedy, but a cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited authority meets unlimited ego in a mortal body that cannot sustain either. The stench that fills your nostrils is not merely the smell of infected flesh and medical incompetence. It is the odor of a system of government that has become as diseased and corrupted as the body of the man who embodies it. Every desperate attempt to maintain the fiction of royal magnificence while the king's body rots from within reveals the fundamental absurdity of claiming divine authority while remaining subject to the same biological processes that affect every human being. The mechanical devices required to move Henry's bloated carcass from room to room serve as perfect metaphors for a monarchy that can only function through artificial support systems that grow more elaborate as the reality they are designed to conceal becomes more obvious. The tragedy of Henry VIII lies not in his inevitable mortality, but in his refusal to accept the limitations that mortality imposes on even the most powerful human beings. His desperate attempts to prove his continued virility through oversized codpieces and teenage wives represent the futile struggle of ego against biology, while his escalating violence against anyone who reminded him of his mortality reveals the paranoia that accompanies the denial of obvious reality. The king who claimed to speak for God on earth ended his life as a walking advertisement for the physical and moral corruption that absolute power inflicts on those who wield it without restraint. In the end, the most bizarre thing about Henry VIII was not his medical condition, his dietary habits, or even his monstrous behavior toward his wives and subjects. The most bizarre aspect of his story is how completely he convinced himself and his court to participate in the collective delusion that a man whose body was literally decomposing while he lived somehow remained the magnificent specimen of manhood he had once been. The real horror of Henry's decline was not the physical decay that anyone could see and smell, but the psychological decay that allowed him to order the deaths of thousands of people rather than acknowledge that he was just another mortal man whose time was running out. The explosion of Henry's corpse during his funeral procession serves as the perfect conclusion to a life lived in defiance of natural law and human decency. Even in death, he managed to create a spectacle that combined grotesque comedy with profound revulsion, leaving his attendants to clean up a mess that perfectly symbolized the chaos he had created throughout his reign. The dogs licking up the remains of the king who had claimed divine authority provide the final, degrading image of what becomes of pretensions to immortal power when they encounter the inescapable reality of mortal flesh. The lesson of Henry VIII transcends the particular circumstances of Tudor England to speak to universal questions about power, mortality, and the human capacity for self-deception. His story demonstrates how physical pain, psychological pressure, and unlimited authority can combine to transform even the most promising individuals into monsters who destroy everything they touch. But it also reveals the dangers of systems that concentrate so much power in single individuals that their personal dysfunctions become national catastrophes, affecting millions of innocent people. As the putrid smell of decomposing royalty finally fades from your nostrils, and you step away from those nightmare chambers at Hampton Court, you carry with you the knowledge that you have witnessed one of history's most complete demonstrations of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, not just politically, but physically, mentally, and morally. Henry VIII's transformation from golden prince to rotting tyrant stands as eternal testimony to the fact that no amount of wealth, power, or propaganda can ultimately overcome the biological and moral limitations that define human existence. The king is dead, but the stench lingers on as a warning to anyone who believes that power can triumph over mortality, that ego can overcome biology, or that any human being can claim authority that transcends the fundamental equality that death imposes on all flesh.